Okay, so we will, hey Chantal, good morning. We're just getting started. I was a little late in getting started. Okay, so this is our third week in medieval mystical women. And the first week we did Hildegard von Bingen. Last week we did, I'm gonna go over here we did Marjorie Kemp, who is, probably my sister then. And man, whether I want it to be or not. And then this week, we are going to talk about Julian. And so I'll open us in prayer this morning with one of Julian's very famous prayers. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
God of your goodness, give me yourself. You are enough for me. And anything less that I could ask for would not do you full honor. And if I ask anything that is less, I shall always lack something, but in you alone, I have everything. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so a review of the definition of mysticism. Again, it's been called the science of the love of God and the life which aims at union with God. And so far, we're 3 for 3 that there's these women that absolutely are trying to attain full union with God. Also, again, just some quick review of the distinctions and commonalities. They're usually single, virgins or widows, and they're sometimes associated with the religious order. If not in themselves, then certainly adjacent. And you will see that Julian also uses this argument that when her voice is the loudest voice in the room, she says that God often elects the weak to confound the strong. And I really, again, think that this is such a clever argument, even though I believe it wasn't meant to be clever, probably in its intention, definitely a little more pure intention than what I think is quite a clever way to say, I've got authority. And again, the characteristics, typically there's 7 types of visions, at least that Elizabeth Petroff really ties in there. And we could do a whole series on just the different types of visions and the women that experience them, and the men, of course, but focusing on the women. They usually involve some sort of incarnational manifestation. There's a really strong sense of the body and the self. There's usually some form of isolation, illness, virginity, mystical death, and ecstasy. And then, of course, there is this compelling to be able to share that said experience. And this is essentially exactly what's happened. So Hildegard, a little more learned, the learned, the scholarly, woman of many disciplines. And then Marjorie Kemp last week, we know, was the town crier. And she also, the first autobiography, period. And then it also happened to be a woman, and basically invented the memoir, and or as pejoratively call her, the first mommy blogger. But she also sought affirmation. This is our last slide last week, that for as eccentric as Marjorie Kemp was, and then her desire to experience God, which she did, she achieved that level of ecstasy, she also still wanted her affirmation. And so she ended up hooking up with Miss Julian at the end of Julian's life. And the fact that Julian gave her, in a sense, permission and her blessing to say that all the more that when people want to point you out as someone that's crazy, that just means that you dig in, lean into that even more, that this, this is a sign from God. And whether you can read some of their correspondence back and forth, some say that maybe Julian was just tolerating her. I would like to think that Julian's heart truly was so pure that she was able to see Marjorie's intentions. And also just kind of locking us and putting us down in a sense of place of here's what's going on. In 1378, okay, so let me place Julian here. She is born in 1342, okay, so let's just keep this here. I think it's interesting, in 1378 through 1470, you have the papal schism. You have, they're what's called the anti-popes over in France. And so you have a little infighting and some quarreling. 1382, Peasants' Revolt in England. John Wycliffe is quick on the scene. and his followers, and then he died. And then we also have over here on the right side, in 1393 is the possible date that she entered as a anchoress. In 1415, English defeated the French, and 1413 through 16, you can see that's when Marjorie visited Julian. And then sometime after 1416, Julian died. We really don't know a lot about Julian, and I think that it's so interesting that she's probably the most famous mystic that we have of all mystics. And so there's probably a little something to that, right? A little bit of mystery that we can kind of build and frame our story around her. She is the opposite of Marjorie Kemp. We don't have her biography. And so, and I should also say, before we get started, does anybody have any questions about the previous, before we jump into Julian, does anybody have any questions or comments about so far what we've talked about? All right, y'all know I'm gonna rattle on. Okay, so because we don't know much about Julian, there's a little bit of speculation, and it's probably spot on. She was more than likely a widow. She also could have, if she was not a widow, then she could have been a nun. But I think that there is more evidence of her having been a widow, and especially with her visions having to do so much with maternal imagery. I believe that she was a mother as well. She was also probably a woman of pretty comfortable means, that if she had the ability to go and to choose the life of an anchorite or an anchoress, that you had to have it, you had to be a little bit self-sustaining. And it was also, how do I want to say it? She had comfortable means, and also another evidence of that is that she in fact was literate. So in the way that she could read and write, you know, we know that Hildegard couldn't write, but yet she could read, which I always think is really interesting. And so Julian, though, was clearly literate, which yet again reinforces the idea that she at least was from a middle class, if not middle upper class. Norwich was one of the largest and most prosperous towns at the time. And I think that some of her language of economy and profit are evidenced in her visions. And so I think even her community informed at least some of the language of her visions. And let's see here, let's go to my next slide. Okay, so when she was about 30, I love that she says when she was 30 and a half, she was very, very desperately ill. And at the point of death, and a priest came in and showed her a crucifix, and she could barely lift her head. And just as she did, and her eyes were on the crucifix, that is when she reached a state of ecstasy, and God gave her these visions, which she then calls 16 showings. And she has then said her own words is that God shared deep insight into spiritual truth and wisdom. And I think that's interesting is before she was ever even sick, I'm gonna read this quote to you because this is from one of her biographers. It said she had previously asked for 3 specific gifts from God. The first was memory of his passion. The second was bodily sickness in youth and at 30 years of age. And the third was to have from God's gift 3 wounds, specifically the wounds of true contrition, compassion, and a wish-filled yearning for God. And this happens in her second revelation that she explains this. I think that it is fascinating to me that one of the things she would ask for God is suffering. And what do you know, at 30 years old, she's asked for it, and just a half a year later, she's granted this gift of suffering. And I can't help but wonder what her setting was. You know, mind you, the popular theology of the day was that God is to be mistrusted. He is a wrathful God that is always out to get us, and that we are sinners of very little redemption and redemption possibilities. And so I wonder if that informed her desire for this illness and for the sickness. I also think that there's a slide later that it is around the time of the Black Death, the plague there. And so death was all around her. And then here is what she says in her own words. She wrote down her revelations in two parts. There's one called the short text, where she essentially quickly writes them down. And then about 20 years later, she is able to go back and to really expand on it. So you have the abridged and unabridged version. And then she says here, this is it regarding her first vision. And when I was 30 and a half years old, God sent me a bodily sickness in which I lay for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the fourth night, I received all the rites of Holy Church and did not expect to live until day. But after this, I suffered on for 2 days and 2 nights. And on the third night, I often thought that I was at the point of death, and those who were around me also thought this. But in this way, I was very sorrowful and reluctant to die. Not that there was anything on earth that it pleased me to live for, or anything of which I was afraid of, for I trusted God. But it was because I wanted to go on living to love God better and longer, and living so, obtain grace to know and love God more as he is in the bliss of heaven. For it seemed to me that all the time that I had lived here was very little and short in comparison with the bliss which is everlasting. I think that that's, well, tell me about your thoughts of that quote. I'm gonna let you guys tell me, what do you think about that?
Could you restate the thought?
The fact that she didn't want to die as much as she wanted to be joined with God. And she said she has nothing left to live for other than that she wants to go on living to love God better and longer.
I don't know. I think few of us have this depth of despair in the 21st century to relate to that. We're bound up in our homes because of COVID, and we think we're suffering terribly, but we have no idea that the kind of suffering that she experienced there.
I think that is so interesting that is in our pop culture. You hear often that you shouldn't worry about dying if you know where you're going, and often when we've experienced the suffering that she has, this is also a little bit of evidence to the fact that she's lost a husband and children and maybe her family to the plague. And but to say that it almost feels more challenging and more suffering to be able to say that you want to go on living, but not just for suffering's sake, not for the idea that even in her desire, she wants to understand suffering, but not so self-flagellation, not in a masochistic way, but she wants to suffer so that she can know the love of God better, which I think is interesting compared to her theology that comes in very shortly. So after this vision and after these 16 showings, that's when she decides that she wants to become an anchorite or an anchoress. And the definition of an anchorite is someone that dedicated their life to spiritual counsel to others and to writing and contemplation. She entered, and it was an actual cell that she would live in a solitary life. And it's interesting to me, again, this is like desert fathers and mothers, this whole idea of separating away to be closer to God. I think that there's something to be said about the theology of that, right? That somehow you can achieve greater union with God when you're alone on the mountaintop or alone in a cave. But what is cool about her cell is that it had 2 tiny little windows. One window was on the inside that she could receive her physical food and nourishment, but she could also see and be a part of the mass from her side of the cell. And then there was a little cell that was open to the street. And so people knew who she was, and they would come by and talk to her and seek spiritual counsel from her. And so even though she was isolated and wanted all the spiritual contemplation, I know it seems silly, but I think of Charlie Brown and Lucy when it says the doctor is in versus the doctor is out, and that you can just go and pop up next to her and have a little chat with her. And I wondered, did she have a window? Was there like a signal, like a curtain that went up and down over the window that said, I'm in, I'm out? Also, being an anchor, it's what we touched on last week a little bit as well, that there was something that was appealing to women about it. Again, this idea of agency and autonomy. The idea of being locked in a cell was often more appealing than having to be a woman that was at the whims of another man and or society. And so I can't make any judgments about any woman that said, hey, lock me up. It's entirely under her control then. And so this is a fascinating look at St. Julian's there. And of course, we don't even know what her real name is. She was taken on the name of Julian after the church where she was. So you can see, I did not realize, I loved during this research to see on the left over here is one of what the church would have looked like before the Blitz. And then of course here after it, during World War II, was destroyed, and then on the right, rebuilt again. But you see they lost the tower. They never rebuilt that tower. And so I think that was, it's a beautiful, beautiful before and after, and to see it in life there. This was an ancient drawing of it and sketch of it. And I think this image of her is so interesting because it shows the very peaceful, I am Julian sitting there contemplating, and I see that there's bread there and people are in the streets and this very large window. And to me, it looks very romanticized, whereas when I came across this image here, but this is probably more of what she saw was death in the streets of a plague that knew no bounds, that everyone was affected by it. And so I think it's easy to romanticize this beautiful, it's probably what I consider the equivalent of our white Jesus, right? White, blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. But probably reality was a little something more akin to this. A little bit more on being an anchoress. So I'll read this quote here. Before either hermit, anchor, or anchoress established themselves, they had to seek permission from the bishop, show that they had sufficient endowment or some prospect of maintenance and were suitable in character. Anchorites and anchoresses must have sufficient funds to support 1 or 2 servants, as they could not fetch food for themselves. Many had cells in town where alms would be bestowed upon them. Their primary work was prayer, though they might give spiritual counsel to those who sought it. An anchorage generally consisted of 2 or 3 rooms beside the chancel of a church. And we know that she had one cell, 1 room. She also then later did have an assistant there, or a worker that helped transcribe her work later. And she, of course, outlived Julian. Also, I love that, I don't know that I have a picture here yet. You'll see another picture in a little bit. She also had a cat with her. And so she was not completely alone, but of course the cat was there for practical means to keep any rodents and pestilence away that a cat could take care of. She also had a really radical theology in that the fact that God loved rather than condemned was hugely turned everything up on its head. The church was an institution that had become a way of making money and to claim power. And how do you do that? You make people scared and you make them give you money. And this was still at the height of the practice of purchasing indulgences for your loved ones. And so you could pay money, and a priest would come along and say, sure, here you go. You've paid me money. I will say prayers for your dead and everything's going to be okay. They're going to get out of purgatory. And so to radically, I mean, it was, I kind of don't know what kind of theology, if we've had anything that could go against. So not only did she then have this theology that God is love and everything about God is love, she then used feminine language to describe God. And this alone, I kind of can't believe she wasn't in more hot water, probably because she was already locked in a cell. They weren't going to bring her forth for trial. But she continued her correspondence, and she really, she let this language flow. A quote of hers is, "As truly as God is our Father, God is our mother." And something like that seems relatively benign, pushing up against the grain. But then in one of her showings, she speaks of Christ as us, as her children, that we are his children nursing at Christ's breast. And so, that really would have gotten her. And it would get you into some hot water now, even maybe not as an Episcopalian, but certainly many other traditions. I also think it's interesting that a lot of the imagery, this really reinforces the idea to me that she had been a mother at some point. Doesn't mean absolutely there's no definitive answer on that. And absolutely you do not have to have experienced motherhood to understand motherhood, right? That I know plenty of women who have not gone through childbirth, plenty of women who don't have children of their own who still understand motherhood. That as one of her visions, she saw that the cross, she compared that what Christ went through on the cross was the equivalent of that of labor pains. And I can see that analogy. And not to be too cheeky, but I can only imagine that giving birth in the first century, much less in any subsequent century that had no modern medicine or assistance, was quite painful.
Yeah. No epidurals.
Exactly. No epidurals, no, just your midwife there when that baby is stuck breech. I mean, I start to understand how the human race has survived knowing that childbirth is so dangerous. And then she also, of course, not only was God as mother, but God as love. And she really, I cannot explain how radical this was. If you read anything else, any of the other writings going on at that time, and part of the papal schism that was happening was it had everything to do with control. And again, you can only control people by making them afraid and giving them an other to be afraid of. And for this, it was hell for them to be afraid of. She spoke of God as love, as an infinite fountain of love and of joy and of mercy. And God desires intimacy with human beings, motivated not by wrath, but entirely by love. And I love that she says the fullness of joy is to behold God in all. And even our mystics today, Richard Rohr, Thomas Merton, still use this idea of God in all things, not pantheism, that God is all things, but God in all things. Really, she gave language to that. She also was the first female writer that we know of that was a prolific writer. So yet again, these two, Marjorie Kemp started the autobiography. She's tapped for being the first memoirist, and then Julian is the first female author that has written other books and many things. I think this is great. She also says in one of her revelations, when she's going back and describing it in the long text, she says, I was answered in spiritual understanding, and it was said, what do you wish to know your Lord's meaning in this thing? Know it well. Love was his meaning. Who reveals it to you? Love. What did he reveal to you? Love. Why did he reveal it to you? For love. So I was taught that love is our Lord's meaning. And I still think for her to have come to this revelation in the middle of a plague, under the wrathful, power-hungry church, that she knew that she was a part of this church. She was fully loved the church. So for her to experience this really was a radical notion. It changed her entire perspective. So I think I can ascribe the world in front of the text and say she was a feminist in secret. Like this was a little bit of an agenda. It truly wasn't. Her only experience with God had been a part of this wrathful, vengeful God. And so when she had these showings, it changed everything.
It's really actually to me kind of amazing that she had this perception of God as love because in similar circumstances, and especially I would think if one had lost a husband and a child, you know, a lot of people would be in the frame of mind of why me?
Yeah.
Why, you know, if God is such a loving God, why is God allowing all this suffering? And that just makes her perception of God as love to me all the more amazing.
Absolutely right. That to not, in and amidst all of that suffering, and even her desire, remember at the beginning, she prayed to feel the suffering and to come out the other side and to see love on the other side. I think that has to be divine revelation. You know, that can only be, I don't know that we could come to that capacity and that perspective on our own. Thank you for that, Chantel. I love that she uses the word homely a couple of times, and it is really the definition there that the way I understand it is that it means familiar and comforting. And she has this really great image of a hazelnut. And so I like that some of the iconography of hers, you'll see her either with a cat right here or with a little hazelnut. And I'll quote you from one of her showings here too, and it says, "And in this, he showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. And this little thing, I saw 3 properties. The first is that God made it. Second is that God loves it. The third is that God preserves it. But what did I see in it? It is that God is the creator and the protector and the lover. For until I am substantially united unto him, I can never have perfect rest or true happiness until, that is, I am so attached to him that there can be no created thing between my God and me." And I love that she has taken something as small as a hazelnut and has found God there. It makes me think of how we can explore the wonders of, I watch a documentary on National Geographic, and it goes into the detail of a bird's eye, right? And it causes just such a wonder because we now have science and cameras to do that. But she was able to take a small hazelnut, something that is of the created order, and to understand these 3 properties of God. Any thoughts on that, of the hazelnut? All right, I'm gonna give you a couple of more quotes here that she had from her Revelation.
I just wanted to say something about the
Yeah.
hazelnut.
Yeah.
To me, it kind of expresses the creation of the whole universe in this very small scale. What a hazelnut goes through, just like what a butterfly goes through. I mean, I don't know the details of that, and I don't know if I'm accurate about that or not, but
Absolutely accurate, 100% accurate. That is the way that hazelnut imagery has been interpreted, that it is a vision of the entire universe. Hildegard was also gifted a vision of the way the universe was created, and that is exactly right. That you can use that imagery then to apply it to anything, universe included there. Here also is that when people wanted to question her authority, she yet again pulled that card that says, "God forbid that you should say or assume that I am a teacher. For that is not what I mean, nor did I ever mean it. For I am a woman, ignorant and frail. Just because I am a woman, must I therefore believe that I must not tell you about the goodness of God, when I saw the same time both his goodness and his wish that it should be known?" I love to ascribe this very modern day feminist theology, but that is me reading back into history. I think she fully believed that she was the frailer, lesser sex, but I believe she also felt it so important that desire, that compelling to know that God needs these people to know what he has revealed to me, that I have been a special one. There've been a few other writings with other mystics. They feel compelled in the way that Mary was compelled to share in the birthing of Christ, that she had to put it out there. And so this is in their way birthing a truth that the world needs to know. Another quote here for her is, "And so our mother, in whom our parts are kept unparted, works in us in various ways. For in our mother, Christ, we profit and grow, and in mercy he reforms and restores us. And through the power of his passion and his death and rising again, he unites us to our essential being. This is how our mother mercifully acts to all his children who are submissive and obedient to him." And this is where I really want to turn it over to you guys as well to talk about this feminine attributes of Christ. And what do you guys think about that? And as Episcopalians or personally and individually, what does this language make you think of, or how does it feel? What do you think?
Well, it makes me think of the terms that Jung used about anima and animus, the anima being the feminine side of a man and the animus being the masculine side of a woman.
Sure.
And, you know, I think in history, we really made a mistake to make it a patriarchal God. You know, I'm looking at I'm hoping for the day, and I'm not going to see it in my lifetime, but in the Catholic Church where they have 60 women cardinals and 60 men cardinals. That's when we'll find true, you know, that's when we'll start getting into balance and becoming just a more balanced church and a more balanced whatever. Like, that's what comes to mind when you say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's very insightful.
Well, reading this, it reminds me, you know, there's really feminine imagery of God in Deuteronomy and the Psalms and in Jesus's statements. I know Deuteronomy talks about the God who bore you, and it doesn't mean carried you, it means gave birth to you. So that's a pretty clear feminine imagery of God. And you know, I can't help but think that probably she knew that. You know, although Wycliffe, you know, was around her time. I mean, could she read Latin? Could she read the Bible for herself?
Sure. I'm not sure if she could read the Vulgate there, but it wouldn't surprise me. It would have at least been read to her. She would be familiar with it. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just from a sort of a practical part, it's just women are more nurturing, more caring than men are, particularly to their children. I mean, men are, you know, like Stoics, where women are more caring. You know, they nurse their babies. It's thank goodness that's the way God is. Mothering, loving, caring. You know, a mother always loves her children regardless. She never gives up on them. You know, fathers will reject their sons. You know, it seems to me it's totally a blessing, and it's true. My experience is that I agree with that. This woman is truly insightful. She was I'm impressed. I'm moved by it.
I think she was able to pull together that same thing, Daniel. She was well versed enough in scripture to pull it together, right? To see that there was the divine feminine. Hildegard definitely has her own theology on it, but it seems that Julian has tapped into something a little more accessible about the divine feminine. And what I think is so great in this last quote is she still uses male pronouns, even though referring to him as mother. And that just alone is interesting to me, I guess, especially now in 2021, as we're learning a little bit more about gender and gender fluidity and understanding a little more about pronouns. And I love that. I mean, this was, you know, 1300s, and she's already on this, that being able to see that there is the fluidity of it. I just think that is she wasn't afraid to go there, so to speak, that she really felt like she had to speak her truth and that this was needing to be known. Charlie, I too, whether I'm, of course, always want to say that there's no difference in the genders, but it was, and I think that's what makes it all the more, there is a difference in the genders, and particularly in a social setting like that. We were not in a matriarchal society. And so I think that this is why it's all the more challenging and a little bit profound in that way. Any other thoughts there on her language?
This is a kind of tangential, but I can't help but wonder, and of course I know very little about the historical events and how people responded. I wonder if she represents an alternative way of looking at the historical circumstances, the plague. I wonder if many people's idea was that the plague happens because of human sin and it's a punishment from God, and that although she's not saying what other people might be saying, and I don't know if they were or not, but she may be offering maybe an alternative vision for the circumstances of her time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be so curious too to see, because her visions and the way she talks about them, especially then in the longer text, it is not in the same way that Marjorie Kemp wrote about, you really had a sense of place and time. And Marjorie even wrote about her perspective on the events that were happening, whereas Julian really didn't. And I think that would be really interesting to know what her take on what was happening with the plague. It's fascinating to me that during the year of the pandemic, people have tapped back into Julian. In 2020, I'd read that there was some statistic that Googling her was up however many percentage points, because here she is living in isolation during the plague. And what is it that she wanted to do? She wanted to slow down and think more and contemplate more about God and the love of God. And I think that brings us to the last slide here that I think is fascinating, that through all of the death, through all of her pain, her loss, her probably most famous saying is that in one of her visions, she asked God and what to do, essentially, and going on and asking to deeper, further understand and explain things. And she said, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. The fact that she was able to come to that conclusion and embrace that in the midst of everything else, mind-boggling to me, right? She has kept a posture of openness to the divine in a way that I don't think I ever could. I don't know that I could be that open to it. I've got my own agenda that I want to bring to God, but all indeed shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Are there any other final thoughts and comments or anything so far about Julian or any of the other women?
Well, one of the other things I thought was this, to me, it seems to make a statement about when someone has a rich, mystical prayer life. Thomas Merton said that intimacy with God is very demanding on our humanity. And, her intimacy with God was very demanding on her humanity, for sure. Mm-hmm. But the wisdom that came out of that, and I really want to thank you, like Charlie did, about what you brought out about her. I knew little about her, but I mean, what a gutsy, profound woman. And I think that comes out of a rich interior life. She's just communicating what she's being revealed within.
It's even cool to think that this is still available, that they didn't destroy all her documents and all her thoughts.
That's right.
Because of the way, just that's a miracle in itself, right?
That's exactly right, Charlie. I think the fact that her words have been able to be preserved, and it was other women that preserved them. So I think that alone is great. Well, I'm glad you guys have gotten at least a little food for thought here today. I would say continue to dig into Julian. Although she was not named a doctor of the church in the way that Hildegard was, she is definitely considered to be one of the great theologians of the church. And I think that that's a high honor for a medieval woman. You guys have been great. I guess it's time for us to, I've got to go get ready for worship here. And I hope that I'll be at school next week. So we're going to have a week off. And I think Scott is going to do a class on the BCP maybe. And then I will be back in the 4th week. And I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. I had something in mind, but then something else has popped up. So we're going to leave you hanging again, but know that we're going to have some other medieval ladies that we're looking into. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for spending your time here with me this morning.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, you guys have a great day.
Thank you, Carrie.
Okay, I'm gonna turn this one off over here. Thanks, Chantal, for coming again. And what happened to your arm? Shoulder surgery.
Oh.
Mouse.